She was chosen by the gods, bound to the most powerful alpha in existence, until the night her own blood came back to steal it all. This isn't just about a stolen mate. This is about a woman who gave everything to a system that was rigged from the start, and the moment she finally stopped begging and started burning it all down. If you want to see how far betrayal can push someone before they snap, you need to stay until the very end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to know where my tribe is watching from, because this story, it's for everyone who's ever been replaced by someone who didn't deserve a damn thing. Lyra Vance knew the taste of power before she ever understood what it meant to lose it. She stood at the edge of the Northern Clan's great hall, her fingers pressed flat against the stone archway, feeling the cold seep through her skin like a warning she should have heeded years ago. The hall was alive with voices, the kind that filled space but said nothing of value. Courtiers and clan leaders mingled beneath chandeliers forged from iron and bone, their laughter echoing off walls that had witnessed centuries of bloodshed and broken oaths. But tonight the laughter felt different, hollow, mocking. She watched him from across the room. Kyle Draven, Alpha King of the Northern Clans, her mate, her destiny, the man the gods themselves had bound her to through a ceremony so sacred that even speaking of it outside clan walls was punishable by death. He was speaking to someone. Lyra couldn't see who at first. The crowd shifted, bodies moving like a tide, and then it parted just enough for her to catch a glimpse of dark hair, a delicate hand resting on his forearm, a smile that looked painted on with intention. Mira, her sister. Lyra's chest tightened, not with jealousy, not yet, but with something older, something that tasted like rust and felt like a blade pressed just beneath the ribs. Mira had been gone for 7 years, exiled, cast out by their father for reasons no one spoke of aloud, but everyone whispered about in the dark. And now she was back, standing in the center of the Alpha King's court like she'd never left, like she hadn't spent nearly a decade rotting in the southern wastelands where the clans sent those they wanted to forget. Lyra pushed off the archway and moved through the crowd. No one stopped her. No one ever did. She was the Alpha's mate, after all. The bond was supposed to make her untouchable, sacred, a living extension of Kyl's power. But as she walked, she felt eyes on her. Too many eyes. And not the kind that held respect. She reached them just as Mira laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a storm, delicate but sharp enough to cut. Kyle, Lyra said. He turned. His eyes were gray, the color of winter sky before snow. They met hers, and for a second, just a second, she thought she saw something flicker there. Recognition, maybe even guilt. Then it was gone. Lyra, he said. His voice was steady, controlled, the voice of a man who ruled over a dozen clans and never let emotion crack his surface. My mate. The word should have felt like an anchor. Instead, it felt like a formality. Mira tilted her head, her smile never faltering. Sister, she said, and the word dripped with honey thick enough to choke on. It's been too long. Lyra didn't smile back. What are you doing here? It wasn't a question. Mira's eyes, green, like their mother's had been, glittered. I was invited. By the king himself. She glanced at Kyle, and he didn't correct her. Didn't say a word. Isn't that right, Your Majesty? Kyle's jaw tightened, but he nodded. She's been granted clemency. The council agreed. Lyra's pulse spiked. The council. Of course. The same council that had exiled Mira in the first place, now welcoming her back like she was some kind of prodigal daughter, and Kyle had agreed to it without telling her. She forced her voice to stay level. We need to talk. Kyle's gaze flicked to Mira, then back to Lyra. Later. Not later. Now. Mira stepped back, her hands raised in mock surrender. Oh, don't let me get in the way of sacred bond business. I'll just go mingle. She turned, her dress sweeping the floor like a shadow, and disappeared into the crowd before Lyra could say another word. Kyle exhaled through his nose. You're making a scene. I don't care. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a growl. You should. Lyra met his eyes and held them. Why didn't you tell me she was coming back? Because I knew you'd react like this. Like what? Like someone who remembers what she did? Kyle's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air between them. That was 7 years ago, Lyra. People change, do they? He didn't answer. Instead, he straightened, his hand brushing her shoulder in a gesture that might have looked affectionate to anyone watching but felt rehearsed. Cold. We'll talk tonight. In private. Then he walked away. Lyra stood there, alone in the middle of the great hall, surrounded by people who pretended not to notice her humiliation. She didn't go back to their chambers that night. Instead, she walked the outer walls of the fortress, where the wind was sharp enough to sting, and the guards knew better than to speak to her when she looked like this. The northern clan's capital was built into the side of a mountain, carved from black stone that drank in the cold and held it like a grudge. Below, the city sprawled out in layers, markets and training yards and homes packed so tight you could hear your neighbor's heartbeat through the walls. Lyra had grown up here. She knew every street, every alley, every shortcut between the lower districts and the palace gates. She'd been raised to rule beside Kael, trained from childhood to be the perfect mate, the perfect queen, and she'd believed it, all of it, until tonight. She stopped at the eastern watchtower and leaned against the parapet, her breath fogging in the freezing air. Her hands were shaking, not from the cold, from something deeper, something she didn't want to name yet. You're thinking too loud. Lyra didn't flinch. She'd heard him approach. His footsteps were too deliberate to miss. Elias Storm stepped up beside her, his arms crossed over his chest. He was broader than Kael, rougher around the edges, with scars that told stories he never bothered to share. He was also her closest ally, the only person in the court who didn't treat her like a trophy or a threat. He looked out over the city. So, she's back, Lyra nodded, and Kael didn't tell you. Another nod. Elias exhaled slowly. That's bold, even for him. Lyra turned to face him. What do you know? Elias hesitated. That was rare. He was the kind of man who said what he thought and didn't apologize for it. But now, standing under the pale light of the moon, he looked almost uncertain. Elias. He met her eyes. There are rumors. There are always rumors. Not like this. He glanced back toward the great hall, his jaw tight. People are saying Mira didn't just come back for clemency. They're saying she's here for something else. Lyra's stomach dropped. What? Elias didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was low. Careful. They're saying she's here for a mate bond. The words hit her like a fist to the chest. That's not possible, Lyra said. I'm already bonded to Kael. The ceremony was sacred. I know. Elias's expression was grim. But there are ways to break a bond. Old ways. Forbidden ways. Lyra's mind raced. She thought of Mira's smile, the way Kael had looked at her, the way he'd dismissed Lyra in front of the entire court. No, she said. He wouldn't. Elias didn't argue. But he didn't agree either. She confronted Kael that night. He was in their chambers, standing by the window with a glass of something dark in his hand. He didn't turn when she entered. We need to talk, Lyra said. You've made that clear. She crossed the room and stood in front of him, forcing him to look at her. What is Mira really doing here? Kael's eyes were unreadable. I told you. Clemency. Don't lie to me. He set the glass down, his movements slow and deliberate. I'm not lying. Then why do I feel like I'm losing you? The words came out raw, unfiltered, and she hated herself for saying them. But they were true. She could feel it. The bond between them. The thing that was supposed to be unbreakable. It was fraying, thinning, like a rope being cut one strand at a time. Kael's expression softened, just a fraction. You're not losing me, Lyra. Then prove it. He reached for her, his hand cupping her face. His touch was warm, familiar, but it didn't feel like it used to. I will, he said. But when he kissed her, it felt like goodbye. Boom. The next morning, Lyra found Mira in the gardens. Her sister was sitting on a stone bench beneath a willow tree, her hands folded in her lap like she was posing for a portrait. She looked up when Lyra approached, her smile bright and empty. Sister, Mira said, I was hoping we'd get a chance to talk. Lyra didn't sit. What do you want? Mira tilted her head. Is that any way to greet family? You're not family, not anymore. Mira's smile didn't falter. 7 years and you're still holding a grudge. That's sad, Lyra. Really? Lyra's hands clenched into fists. You know what you did. Do I? The innocence in Mira's voice was so convincing it almost made Lyra doubt herself. Almost. Stay away from Kael, Lyra said. Mira laughed. Oh, sweetheart, I don't think you understand. She stood, brushing off her dress with delicate fingers. Kael and I have been talking. A lot. And well, let's just say he's starting to see things differently. Lyra's blood went cold. What are you talking about? Mira stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. You were never supposed to be his mate, Lyra. The bond was a mistake. And soon, everyone's going to know it. Before Lyra could respond, Mira turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the garden with a truth she wasn't ready to face. That night, Lyra couldn't sleep. She lay in bed beside Kael, listening to the sound of his breathing, and tried to remember the last time she'd felt safe, the last time the bond had felt real. She couldn't. So she got up, wrapped herself in a cloak, and went to the one place she knew she'd find answers. The Hall of Records was buried deep beneath the fortress, protected by wards older than the clans themselves. Lyra had been there only once before, during her bonding ceremony, and even then she'd been escorted by elders who watched her every move. Tonight, she was alone. She moved through the narrow corridors, her footsteps echoing off stone walls, until she reached the chamber where the clan's most sacred texts were kept. The air was thick with dust and something else, something that tasted like old magic and secrets no one was meant to uncover. She found the book she was looking for on a shelf near the back. It was bound in leather so dark it looked black, with symbols etched into the cover that made her skin crawl. She opened it carefully, her hands trembling, and began to read. What she found made her blood run cold. There were rites, ancient rites, ways to sever a bond, ways to steal one, and at the center of it all was a ceremony that could only be performed during a blood moon. The next blood moon was 3 days away. Lyra closed the book and stood there in the dark, her mind racing. Mira wasn't just here to reclaim her place in the clan. She was here to take everything, and Kael, whether he knew it or not, was letting her. Lyra didn't tell anyone what she'd found. Instead, she watched. She watched Mira move through the court like smoke, slipping into conversations and planting seeds of doubt. She watched Kael pull away, his attention drifting more and more toward her sister. She watched the elders whisper in corners, their eyes dark with something that looked like conspiracy. And she waited. Because if Mira wanted to play this game, Lyra was going to make sure she understood the rules. On the second night before the blood moon, Lyra cornered Elias in the training yard. I need your help, she said. He looked up from sharpening his blade, his expression wary. What kind of help? The kind that could get us both killed. Elias stood, crossing his arms. I'm listening. Lyra told him everything, the rites, the blood moon, Mira's plan. And when she was done, Elias was silent for a long time. Then he said, You know what you're asking me to do. I do. And you're sure. Lyra met his eyes. I am sure. Elias nodded slowly. Then I'm with you. The night of the blood moon came faster than Lyra expected. The ceremony was held in the great hall beneath a sky stained red by the moon's light. Every clan leader was there, every elder, every witness who mattered. And at the center of it all stood Mira, dressed in white, her hands raised to the sky. Kael stood beside her. Lyra watched from the shadows, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. She knew what was coming. She'd read the rites. She'd seen the symbols carved into the floor. She knew that in a matter of minutes, Mira would complete the ceremony and sever Lyra's bond. But then Elias stepped forward, and everything changed. Elias stepped forward, and the air in the great hall shifted like a living thing sensing prey. Every eye turned to him. The elders froze mid-chant. Mira's hands, still raised toward the blood-red moon visible through the skylight, trembled just enough for Lyra to notice from her place in the shadows. Kael's expression went from composed to something darker, something that looked like recognition mixed with dread. Elias didn't stop walking until he stood directly in front of Mira, blocking her view of the altar where the bonding symbols had been carved into stone older than memory. This ceremony is void, Elias said. His voice cut through the hall like a blade through rot. One of the elders, a woman named Thessa with skin like parchment and eyes that had witnessed too many wars, stepped forward. "You have no authority here, Storm. Stand down." Elias didn't move. "I have every authority." He turned to face the gathered witnesses, his shoulders squared. "This woman is attempting to sever a sacred bond through deception. She's lied to the council, she's manipulated the king, and she's about to commit an act that breaks the oldest laws we have." Mira's face remained perfectly composed, but Lyra saw the shift in her stance, the slight backward lean of someone preparing to flee or fight. "Sister, what is this man talking about?" Her voice was silk wrapped around iron. "Why would he interrupt our ceremony with such baseless accusations?" Lyra stepped out of the shadows. The crowd parted without being asked. She moved through them like water through cracks in stone, inevitable and cold. When she reached the center of the hall, she stood beside Elias, and for the first time in days, she felt the weight in her chest ease just slightly. "Not baseless," Lyra said. "Documented." She pulled the ancient text from beneath her cloak and held it up. The leather binding caught the moonlight, and several of the elders inhaled sharply. They recognized it. They knew what it meant that she had it. Kael's voice rang out. "Lyra, what are you doing?" She met his eyes across the distance. What I should have done the moment she came back. She opened the book to the page she'd marked. These rites require specific conditions. A blood moon, a willing participant to sever the existing bond, and most importantly, they require the original mate to be unaware until the moment of completion. Mira laughed. It was a delicate sound, crafted to seem bewildered and hurt. "You're accusing me of dark magic now? Of conspiracy?" "Sister, you sound paranoid." Lyra ignored her and spoke directly to the council. 3 weeks ago, Mira requested access to the Hall of Records. She claimed she wanted to study our clan's history to better reintegrate. Elder Thessa approved it. Thessa's expression didn't change, but her silence was confirmation enough. Lyra continued. "During those visits, she copied pages from this very text. I found the copies hidden in her chambers this afternoon. She produced a stack of parchment and handed it to the nearest elder, a man named Corvin, whose loyalty to tradition was unquestionable. The pages detail every step of the severance ritual, including the final step where the new mate bond can only be completed if the original mate publicly accepts their replacement." The hall erupted in whispers. Kael moved forward, his hand outstretched. "Let me see that." Corvin handed him the pages. Kael read in silence, his jaw tightening with each line. When he looked up, his gaze went straight to Mira. She didn't flinch. "This is fabricated. Anyone could have placed those in my chambers." She turned to the crowd, her arms spread wide in a gesture of wounded innocence. "I came here seeking forgiveness and family. Instead, I find myself accused by a woman who clearly feels threatened by my return." Elias spoke, his voice low and deadly. "Then explain the charm." Mira went very still. Elias reached into his coat and pulled out a small cloth bundle. When he unwrapped it, a carved stone pendant fell into his palm. It was etched with symbols that made Lyra's skin crawl, the kind of markings that belonged to magic so old it predated the clans themselves. "I found this in the Alpha King's chambers," Elias said, "hidden behind a loose stone near his bed. It's a binding charm. Anyone who sleeps near it becomes susceptible to suggestion, vulnerable to manipulation." Kael's face went white. "That's not possible." Elias met his eyes. "How long have you been sleeping poorly, my king? How long have your thoughts felt clouded? How long have you found yourself agreeing to things that felt wrong, but you couldn't explain why?" Kael said nothing, but Lyra could see the truth settling over him like frost. Mira's composure finally cracked. She took a step back, her eyes darting toward the nearest exit. "You have no proof I placed that there." Lyra moved closer, her voice dropping to something almost intimate. "You always were careless, Mira. You think because you've been gone for 7 years that no one remembers how you operate. But I do. I remember every lie, every manipulation, every time you took something that wasn't yours and convinced everyone it was." Mira's mask slipped completely. Her face twisted into something ugly and raw. "You never deserved him. You were handed everything on a silver platter while I was thrown away like garbage, all because you were born first, all because Father thought you were more worthy." There it was. the truth that had been festering for years. Lyra felt something inside her shift. Not break, transform. She'd spent so long trying to be what everyone else needed her to be that she'd forgotten what it felt like to simply be angry. To let that anger burn without apology. "You're right," Lyra said. "I was given things you weren't. And maybe that wasn't fair. But you know what I didn't do?" She stepped closer until they were inches apart. "I didn't try to destroy you. I didn't try to steal your life. I didn't come back after years of exile and systematically dismantle everything you'd built just to watch you suffer." Mira's eyes glittered with something that looked like tears but felt like venom. "You still don't understand. This was never about fairness. This was about taking back what should have been mine from the beginning." Kael's voice cut through the tension. "Enough!" He strode forward, and the authority in his presence was undeniable. "This ceremony is over. Mira Vance, you are hereby charged with conspiracy, use of forbidden magic, and attempted destruction of a sacred bond. You will be detained until the full council can convene." 2 guards moved to flank Mira. She didn't resist, but the look she gave Lyra was pure poison. "This isn't over, sister. Not even close." As they led her away, the hall slowly began to empty. Elders murmured to each other, their expressions troubled. Clan leaders exchanged meaningful glances. Everyone understood that what had happened here tonight would have consequences that rippled far beyond this single ceremony. Lyra stood in the center of the emptying hall, her hands shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. She felt Elias's presence beside her before he spoke. "You did well," he said quietly. "I don't feel well." "You will." She turned to look at him. His face was cast in shadow and moonlight, all hard angles and old scars. "Thank you. For stepping forward. For believing me." Elias shrugged. "I didn't do it just for you." The weight of that statement hung between them, but before Lyra could respond, Kael approached. Elias gave her shoulder a brief squeeze and then walked away, leaving them alone. Kael stopped a few feet away, close enough to speak privately, but not close enough to touch. "We need to talk." Lyra nodded. She was exhausted, every muscle in her body screaming for rest, but she knew this conversation couldn't wait. They walked in silence through the empty corridors until they reached Kael's private study. It was a room Lyra had been in hundreds of times, but tonight it felt foreign. The furniture looked the same, the tapestries on the walls unchanged, but something fundamental had shifted. Kael closed the door and leaned against his desk, his arms crossed. "I owe you an apology." Lyra waited. He ran a hand through his hair, a rare show of uncertainty. "The charm. If what Elias said is true, then I've been compromised. My judgment has been compromised. I should have trusted you. I should have seen what Mira was doing, but you didn't." "No, I didn't." Lyra moved to the window and looked out over the darkened city. The blood moon was fading now, returning to its normal pale color. "Why did you let her back, Kael? The real reason." He was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "Because she reminded me of something I'd forgotten." "What?" "That even the bond can feel like a cage sometimes." The words hit Lyra like a physical blow. She turned to face him. "What are you saying?" Kael met her eyes, and for the first time she saw real vulnerability there. "I'm saying that our bond was arranged, decided by elders and prophecy and tradition. We never chose each other, Lyra. We were simply told that we belonged together, and we accepted it because that's what was expected. And Mira made you question that." He nodded. "She was free in a way we've never been. Exiled, yes, but free. And when she came back, she brought that freedom with her. It was intoxicating." Lyra felt something crack inside her chest. "So what now? Do you want to break the bond?" Kael closed his eyes. "I don't know." The honesty was brutal, but it was also the first real truth he'd given her in weeks. Lyra crossed the room and stood in front of him. She could feel the bond between them, that invisible thread that had tied them together since the ceremony years ago. It pulsed weakly, damaged by Mira's interference, but not yet broken. "I need you to listen to me very carefully," Lyra said. Her voice was steady despite the chaos in her heart. "I didn't choose you either. Not really. I was told you were my destiny, and I believed it because I was raised to believe it. But somewhere along the way, I made the choice to honor that bond, to build something real with you, to stand beside you, not because tradition demanded it, but because I wanted to." Kale's expression was tortured. Lyra, I'm not finished. She held up a hand. You just admitted you don't know if you want this bond. And that tells me everything I need to know. Because I do know. I know exactly what I want. I want someone who chooses me every single day, not someone who stays because they're obligated to. She stepped back, and the distance between them felt like miles. So, here's what's going to happen, Lyra continued. We're going to let the council deal with Mira. We're going to restore order to the clan, and then you're going to decide, really decide. If you want this bond, if you want me, then you're going to have to prove it. Not with words, with action. And if I can't? Lyra met his eyes. Then we break it completely, and we both walk away. The silence that followed was suffocating. Kale looked like he wanted to argue, to say something that would fix this, but they both knew there was nothing left to say. Lyra left the study without another word. She made it halfway down the corridor before her legs gave out. She leaned against the wall, sliding down until she was sitting on the cold stone floor, and finally let herself feel everything she'd been holding back. The anger, the grief, the devastating realization that the life she'd built was collapsing around her. She didn't cry. She was too tired for tears. Instead, she sat there in the dark and let the weight of it all settle on her shoulders. That was how Elias found her. He didn't say anything at first, just sat down beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, and waited. It's broken, Lyra finally said. The bond. Maybe not officially, but it's broken. Elias nodded. I know. How long have you known? Since the night Mira came back. I saw the way Kyle looked at her, and I saw the way he stopped looking at you. Lyra turned to him. Why didn't you say anything? Because you weren't ready to hear it, and now you are. They sat in silence for a while. Lyra could hear distant sounds from the city below. Guards changing shifts, market vendors preparing for the morning, life continuing as if the world hadn't just tilted on its axis. What happens next? Lyra asked. Elias turned to look at her, his expression serious. That depends on you. You can stay and fight for a bond that's already broken. Or you can walk away and build something new. I've never been good at walking away. Maybe it's time to learn. Lyra studied his face. There was something in his eyes that she'd never allowed herself to notice before. Something that went beyond friendship or loyalty. Elias. He held up a hand. Don't. Not yet. You need time to figure out what you want without anyone else clouding your judgment. Even me. He stood and offered her his hand. She took it, letting him pull her to her feet. But I want you to know something, Elias said. When you're ready, if you're ready, I'll be here. Not because of tradition or prophecy or any sacred bond, but because I choose you. I've always chosen you. Before she could respond, he walked away, leaving her alone in the hallway with words that felt like both a promise and a challenge. Lyra stood there for a long time, her mind racing. Everything she'd believed about her life, her purpose, her destiny, had been built on a foundation that was now crumbling. And instead of terrifying her, it felt almost liberating. She thought about Mira, locked away somewhere in the fortress, still clinging to the idea that taking Lyra's place would somehow make her whole. She thought about Kyle, struggling with a bond that had become more obligation than choice. She thought about Elias, waiting patiently for her to see what had been in front of her all along. And she thought about herself, about the woman she'd been and the woman she was becoming. For the first time in her life, Lyra Vance wasn't defined by who she was bound to. She was just herself, flawed and furious and free. The next morning, the council convened. Lyra sat in the gallery watching as Mira was brought before the elders in chains. Her sister looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of her crimes, but her eyes still held that spark of defiance. The charges were read: conspiracy, illegal use of forbidden magic, attempted destruction of a sacred bond. Each one carried a sentence severe enough to ensure Mira would never threaten anyone again. Elder Corvin, serving as judge, spoke. Mira Vance, you have been found guilty on all counts. The council has deliberated and reached a decision. Lyra leaned forward, her heart pounding. Corvin continued, you are hereby sentenced to permanent exile. You will be escorted beyond our borders and forbidden from ever returning. Should you attempt to do so, the sentence will be death. Mira's face went pale. That's it? No execution? No chains? Corvin's expression was granite. Living with what you've done will be punishment enough. As the guards led Mira away, she turned and locked eyes with Lyra one final time. The look she gave was complicated. Hate and envy and something that might have been regret all mixed together. Then she was gone. Lyra felt no satisfaction, no triumph, just a hollow sense of closure that didn't quite close anything. Kyle found her after the proceedings ended. They stood together on one of the fortress balconies, the morning sun harsh and unforgiving. "I've made my decision," Kyle said. Lyra's stomach clenched. "Tell me." He turned to face her fully. "I want to try. I want to repair what's been damaged. But you were right. I need to choose you every day, not just accept that we're bound together." Lyra looked at him, really looked at him, at the man she'd spent years beside. And what she saw was someone trying to do the right thing, but not necessarily the honest thing. "No," she said quietly. Kale blinked. "What?" "I said no." Lyra took a breath. "I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I don't want someone who has to try to choose me. I want someone for whom choosing me is as natural as breathing. Lyra, we can work through this." She shook her head. "The bond is broken, Kale. Maybe not in the traditional sense, but in every way that matters. We can either cling to something that's already dead, or we can be brave enough to let it go. You want to break it officially. I think we have to." Kale looked out over the city. "If we do this, there's no going back. The council will need to approve it. There will be ceremonies, rituals, and the clans will see it as a sign of weakness." "Let them," Lyra said. "I'm done living my life according to what the clans expect. And after, what will you do?" Lyra smiled, and it felt like the first genuine expression she'd worn in weeks. "I have no idea, and that's exactly the point." They stood together in silence, two people who had been bound by fate now choosing to unbind themselves. It was terrifying and exhilarating and completely necessary. That afternoon, Lyra walked to the temple where bonding ceremonies were performed. The priestess there was ancient, her face a map of wrinkles and wisdom. "I want to begin the severance ritual," Lyra said. The priestess studied her. "Are you certain? Once begun, it cannot be undone." "I'm certain." The old woman nodded. "Then we begin at sunset. Bring the king. This must be done together." That evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Lyra and Kyle stood before the priestess. The ritual was simpler than the bonding had been. No grand ceremony, no witnesses, just the two of them and the priestess and words older than memory. As the priestess chanted, Lyra felt the bond begin to unravel. It was painful, like tearing muscle from bone, but also strangely relieving. With each severed thread, she felt lighter, freer. When it was done, she stood across from Kyle and felt nothing. No pull, no connection. Just two people who had once meant everything to each other and now were strangers. "Goodbye," Kyle said. "Goodbye," Lyra replied. And then she walked away. She found Elias waiting outside the temple. He didn't ask how it went. He didn't need to. He could see it on her face. "What now?" he asked. "Now," Lyra said. "I figure out who I am without a bond defining me." Elias smiled. "Need any help with that?" "Maybe." She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw possibility instead of obligation. "But only if you promise not to try to fix me or save me or turn me into something I'm not." Wouldn't dream of it. They walked together through the city as night fell, two people who had finally stopped running from what they wanted and started walking toward it. Lyra didn't know what came next. She didn't know if she and Elias would build something real or if she'd discover she didn't need anyone at all. She didn't know how the clans would react to her breaking the bond or what role she'd play in the kingdom now. But for the first time in her life, those questions didn't terrify her, because she finally understood something fundamental. Destiny was just another word for expectation, and she was done living up to anyone's expectations but her own. 3 weeks later, a messenger arrived at the fortress. Lyra was in the training yard when the guards brought him to her. He was covered in dust and blood, his horse nearly dead from exhaustion. "Message for Lyra Vance," he gasped. She took the sealed letter, her stomach tightening at the unfamiliar crest pressed into the wax. When she opened it, the words made her blood run cold. "Your sister has allied with the southern clans. They're marching north, and they're coming for you." Lyra looked up from the letter to find Elias watching her from across the yard. He must have seen something in her expression because he immediately strode over. "What is it?" She handed him the letter. He read it quickly, his jaw tightening. "How long do we have?" The messenger coughed. 3 days. Maybe 4. Lyra looked toward the horizon, where somewhere beyond the mountains an army was gathering, led by her sister, coming to finish what the ritual had failed to accomplish. She should have felt afraid, should have felt overwhelmed. Instead, she felt something else entirely, clarity. She turned to Elias. "Gather the commanders. We have work to do." As he walked away to carry out her orders, Lyra stood alone in the training yard and let herself smile. Mira wanted war. Fine, she'd get one. But this time, Lyra wouldn't be fighting to hold on to something that was never really hers. She'd be fighting for something far more dangerous, her freedom. And she'd burn the whole world down before she let anyone take that from her again. The war room smelled like old leather and desperation. Lyra stood over the map table, her fingers tracing the mountain passes between the northern and southern territories. Red markers indicated enemy positions. Blue showed their own forces. There was far too much red and not nearly enough blue. Commander Thane, a scarred veteran who had served her father, leaned over the opposite side of the table. "They'll come through the Widow's Pass. It's the only route wide enough for an army that size." Lyra shook her head. "That's what they want us to think. Mira knows we'd fortify the pass. She'll split her forces, send a smaller contingent through Widows as a distraction while the main army takes the eastern ridge." Thane's eyes narrowed. The eastern ridge is a suicide route. Steep terrain, easy to defend. "Which is why we won't expect it," Elias said from his position near the window. He'd been quiet most of the meeting, watching the horizon like he could see the enemy approaching through sheer force of will. "Your sister is betting that you'll underestimate her desperation." Lyra met his eyes. "She's right. I did underestimate her once. I won't make that mistake again." Kael entered the room without knocking. He'd been doing that more often since the bond broke, as if the severance had stripped away whatever formal courtesy had existed between them. His presence still commanded attention, but now it felt separate from her. Distant. "The scouts have returned," Kael said. He moved to the table and placed 3 more red markers on the map. Southern forces confirmed here, here, and here. "They're moving faster than projected." "How much faster?" Lyra asked. 2 days? Maybe less? The room went silent. Every commander present understood what that meant. They weren't ready. The fortifications weren't complete. Half their forces were still scattered across the territory, responding to false alarms that now looked suspiciously like diversions. Lyra felt the weight of every eye on her. She was no longer the Alpha's mate, no longer bound to the throne by sacred ritual, but somehow she'd become the person everyone looked to for answers. Maybe because Kael had proven himself vulnerable to manipulation. Maybe because she'd been the one to expose Mira's conspiracy. Or maybe because people respected someone who'd walked away from power more than someone who clung to it. "We consolidate our forces at the fortress," Lyra said. "Abandon the outer settlements. Bring everyone inside the walls." Thane straightened. "That's 50,000 people. We don't have the supplies to sustain a siege that long. Then we make sure it doesn't last that long." Kael crossed his arms. "What are you suggesting?" Lyra looked down at the map, her mind calculating distances and probabilities and acceptable losses. She hated that last phrase. Acceptable losses. As if any death was acceptable. But that was war. That was leadership. Choosing which people lived and which ones became statistics. "We let them take the pass," Lyra said. "We pull back our forces and make it look like we're retreating in panic. Let Mira think she's won the first engagement easily." "That's insane," Thane said. "You're giving her a strategic position." Lyra's smile was cold. "I'm giving her overconfidence. When she commits her main force through the pass, we collapse it. Bury half her army under a mountain of rock." The silence that followed was different. Calculating. Brutal. Elias spoke first. "That would require perfect timing. And if we miscalculate, we trap our own people. Then we don't miscalculate." Kael studied her face. "When did you become so ruthless?" The question stung more than it should have. Lyra met his eyes. "When I realized that mercy to your enemies is cruelty to your people." She watched something flicker across Kael's expression. Recognition, maybe. Or regret. He'd been raised to rule with honor and tradition, to follow codes that had been written centuries ago by people who never had to make choices this ugly. Lyra was learning that survival didn't care about honor. "The council will need to approve this," Kael said finally. "Then call them." Within the hour, the full council had assembled. Lyra laid out her plan with clinical precision, answering every objection with logic that was hard to argue against. Some of the elders looked horrified. Others looked impressed. Elder Corvin, who had always valued pragmatism over sentiment, was the first to vote in favor. The motion passed. Barely. As the council dispersed, Elder Thessa approached Lyra. She moved slowly, her ancient bones creaking with each step, but her mind was still sharp as winter ice. "Your father would be proud," Thessa said quietly. "Or horrified." Thessa smiled. "Both, probably. That's how you know you're doing something right." She left before Lyra could respond. The next 2 days blurred together in a chaos of preparation. Soldiers moved through the fortress like blood through veins, urgent and necessary. Civilians flooded in from the outer settlements, bringing what they could carry and leaving behind lives they'd built over generations. The blacksmiths worked around the clock. The healers prepared the infirmary for casualties that everyone knew were coming. Lyra slept in 2-hour intervals, never in her own chambers. She moved constantly, checking defenses, talking to commanders, making sure every piece of her plan was in position. She couldn't afford to stop, couldn't afford to think too much about what she was about to do. On the second night, she found herself alone on the eastern wall. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in silver light that made the world look clean and simple. It was a lie. Nothing was clean. Nothing was simple. "You should rest." She didn't turn at the sound of Elias's voice. He had a habit of finding her when she most needed not to be alone but couldn't admit it. He joined her at the wall, close enough that she could feel the heat from his body in the cold air. "Can't sleep," Lyra said. "Neither can I." They stood in silence for a while. Down in the city, she could see cooking fires and hear the distant sound of a child crying. Life continuing even as war approached. It was remarkable how people adapted, how they found normalcy in the worst circumstances. "Are you sure about this plan?" Elias asked. "No." He turned to look at her. "That's honest." Lyra met his eyes. "I'm not sure about anything anymore. 6 weeks ago, I knew exactly who I was and what my life was supposed to be. Now I'm gambling thousands of lives on a strategy that could backfire in a dozen different ways. Second thoughts? Third and fourth thoughts." She looked back out at the city. "But I'm doing it anyway." "Why?" "Because the alternative is worse." Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You've changed." "I know. Is it permanent?" Lyra considered the question. The old Lyra would have deflected, would have made a joke or changed the subject. But that version of herself felt like someone she'd known a long time ago. A different person who'd died when the bond broke. "I think so," she said. "I think you either break completely or you break into something new. And I refuse to shatter." Elias reached out and took her hand. His palm was rough, calloused from years of sword work. It felt real in a way that nothing else did. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said, "I want you to know something. Don't." Elias shook his head. "Yes, you need to hear this." He turned her to face him. "I've watched you walk through fire these past weeks. I've seen you make choices that would break most people. And every single day, I've watched you become more yourself. Not what the bond demanded, not what tradition expected, just you, raw and fierce and uncompromising." His hand came up to cup her face. "And if we survive tomorrow," he continued, "I'm going to court you properly. No bonds, no destiny. Just two people choosing each other because they want to. But if we don't survive, if this is the last quiet moment we get, then I need you to know that loving you has been the easiest choice I've ever made." Lyra felt something crack in her chest. Not breaking, opening. She leaned forward and kissed him, and it felt nothing like kissing Kael had felt. There was no sacred power humming beneath her skin, no sense of cosmic rightness, just want and choice and the terrifying freedom of deciding for herself. When they pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his. "If we survive this," she said, "you can court me, but I'm not easy to love." Elias laughed. "I'd be disappointed if you were." They stood together as the night deepened, two people stealing a moment of peace before the storm. The enemy arrived at dawn. Lyra watched from the command tower as the Southern Army appeared on the horizon like a dark stain spreading across the landscape. They were massive, twice the size intelligence had estimated. Banners snapped in the wind, and the sound of drums echoed across the valley. Beside her, Thane swore under his breath. That's not just the Southern clans. Those are mercenary companies, exile bands from the Eastern territories. She's bought herself an army. Lyra's jaw tightened. Then we make sure she can't afford to keep them. The first engagement happened at midday. Just as Lyra had predicted, a portion of the enemy force moved toward Widow's Pass, while the larger contingent circled toward the eastern approach. Her scouts reported that Mira herself was leading the eastern force. Perfect. Lyra gave the order to pull back from the pass. Her soldiers retreated in staged chaos, making it look panicked and disorganized. From her vantage point, she watched through a distance glass as Mira's forces took the bait. They poured into the pass, eager and overconfident. Now, Lyra said. Thane raised his hand. Engineers stationed in the cliffs above the pass lit their fuses and ran. For a long moment, nothing happened. Lyra's heart hammered against her ribs. Then the mountain moved. The explosion was deafening even from miles away. Rock and earth collapsed inward, filling the pass with thousands of tons of debris. Soldiers scattered like ants, but there was nowhere to run. The avalanche swallowed them whole. Through the distance glass, Lyra watched men die. Watched them disappear under stone. Watched the ones who survived stumble around in shock, looking for commanders who were buried or ways forward that no longer existed. She made herself watch every second, made herself see the cost of her strategy. When the dust settled, Thane spoke quietly. At least 3,000 dead. Maybe more. Lyra lowered the glass. Her hands were steady. That was important. Leaders couldn't shake. Send word to the Eastern Front. Tell them to hold position. Mira will be furious now. She'll make mistakes. But Mira didn't make mistakes. 2 hours later, reports came flooding in. The Eastern Force hadn't retreated after the pass collapsed. Instead, they'd split again, moving faster than should have been possible, and now they were attacking from 3 directions simultaneously. How is she moving that fast? Thane demanded, slamming his fist on the table. It's not possible. Lyra stared at the map, her mind racing. Then she saw it. The pattern. The impossible coordination. The way Mira's forces seemed to know exactly where the northern defenses were weakest. Someone's feeding her information, Lyra said. She looked up at the faces around her. Someone in this room. The accusation hung in the air like poison. Thane's face went red. You're suggesting we have a traitor in the command structure? I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating a fact. Prove it, Thane said. Lyra met his eyes. She was about to respond when the door burst open. A messenger stumbled in, covered in blood. Not his own, judging by the lack of wounds. My lady, the Western Wall. They've breached the Western Wall. That's impossible, Kael said. He'd been standing silent in the corner, but now he moved forward. The Western defenses are our strongest position. The messenger was gasping for air. They had explosives, blew a hole 30 feet wide. They're inside the city. Chaos erupted. Commanders shouted orders. Runners scattered to relay commands. The carefully organized defense was fracturing into panic. Lyra felt time slow down. This was the moment, the pivot point where everything either held together or collapsed completely. She could feel the weight of it pressing down on her shoulders, demanding a decision. Seal the inner gates, she said. Her voice cut through the noise like a blade. Pull everyone back to the fortress proper. Abandon the outer city. Thane whirled on her. There are 10,000 civilians in the outer city, and if we spread our forces trying to protect them, we'll lose everything. You're condemning them to death. I'm making sure some of us survive. The words felt like ash in her mouth, but she didn't take them back. Couldn't take them back. This was what leadership meant. Choosing who lived, accepting that you couldn't save everyone. Kael stepped forward. I won't allow it. Lyra turned to face him. You don't have a choice. I have command of this defense. By whose authority? By the authority of being the only person in this room willing to make the hard calls. Their eyes locked. For a second, Lyra thought Kael might challenge her directly, might pull rank as Alpha King and override her command. But he'd been compromised once already. Everyone knew it. And in this moment, no one trusted him more than they trusted her. Kael looked away first. Do it, Lyra said to the commanders. Seal the gates. As the orders went out, Elias appeared at her side. That was brutal. It was necessary. Elias didn't argue, but she could see the concern in his eyes, not for the decision itself, but for what it was doing to her, for what she was becoming. Lyra pushed the thought away. She could examine her conscience later, if there was a later. The next 3 hours were hell. Fighting spilled through the outer city as civilians tried to reach the inner gates before they closed. Soldiers held the line as long as they could, buying time for people to evacuate. But Mira's forces were everywhere, moving with a coordination that shouldn't have been possible, and the casualties mounted on both sides. Lyra coordinated the defense from the command tower, moving pieces on the map like it was a game board instead of people's lives. She sent reinforcements here, ordered retreats there, made calculations that would haunt her for the rest of her life. And through it all, she kept thinking about the traitor. Someone close enough to know their strategies. Someone with access to command meetings and defense plans. She was still thinking about it when Elder Corvin appeared in the doorway. He looked older than she'd ever seen him. His face was gray, his hands trembling slightly. "My lady, I need to speak with you, privately." Something in his tone made Lyra's blood run cold. She followed him to a small side chamber. As soon as the door closed, Corvin turned to face her. "I know who the traitor is," he said. "Who?" Corvin's expression was tortured. "Me." The words didn't make sense at first. Lyra's brain refused to process them. Corvin had been on the council for 30 years, had served her father loyally, had voted in favor of her strategies even when other elders balked. "What are you talking about?" Corvin's hands were shaking harder now. "Mira came to me before she was exiled, years ago. She told me things, promised me things. I thought I was helping prevent a war." He laughed bitterly. "Instead, I've been feeding her information this entire time." Lyra felt the world tilt. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I just received word that Mira's next target is the Eastern Tower, the one where we've stockpiled all our medical supplies, all our food reserves. If she takes it, we can't sustain a siege. We'll starve within weeks." His voice broke. "I didn't know she'd go this far," Corvin said. "I thought she just wanted recognition, a place in the clan again. I didn't realize she wanted to destroy us completely." Lyra stared at him. This man who'd been at every strategy meeting, who'd voted on every major decision, who'd had access to everything. "How long?" she said quietly. 7 years. 7 years of betrayal. 7 years of feeding their enemy information. 7 years of people dying because of secrets he'd sold. Lyra felt something snap inside her. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet severing of whatever thread had connected her to the person she used to be. She pulled the dagger from her belt. Corvin didn't move, didn't try to defend himself. He just stood there, waiting. "I deserve this," he said. Lyra held the blade steady. Part of her wanted to drive it into his chest, wanted to make him pay for every soldier who died because of his treachery, for every civilian trapped in the outer city, for every choice she'd had to make because he'd stacked the deck against them. But she didn't. Instead, she lowered the blade. "Death is too easy," she said. "You're going to walk out there and tell every commander exactly what you've done. You're going to expose every piece of information you gave Mira, and then you're going to help us turn your betrayal against her." Corvin's eyes widened. "What?" "She knows our defenses because you told her, which means we can predict what she'll expect. We're going to feed her false information through you, make her think we're weak where we're strong, make her commit her forces to positions where we can destroy them." "That could work," Corvin said slowly. "It will work." Lyra's voice was ice. "And when this is over, you'll stand trial for treason. But right now, you're going to help me save what's left of this kingdom." She opened the door. "Move." Corvin stumbled out into the command room. Every head turned. Lyra followed him, her dagger still in her hand. "Tell them," she said. Corvin's voice shook as he confessed. Lyra watched the faces around the room transform from shock to rage to betrayal. Thane looked like he wanted to kill the old man on the spot. Kale's expression was stone. But Elias met Lyra's eyes across the room, and she saw understanding there, saw him recognize what she was doing, turning poison into medicine, using the traitor's knowledge against their enemy. When Corvin finished, the room exploded in shouting. Lyra let it happen for exactly 30 seconds. Then she slammed her dagger into the map table hard enough to crack the wood. Enough, she said. Silence fell. We don't have time for rage, Lyra continued. Mira is expecting Corvin to report that our eastern tower is lightly defended. Instead, we're going to tell him to report that we've moved all our reserves to the western barracks. We'll fortify the tower with our best fighters and wait for her to walk into a trap. That's risky, Thane said. If Corvin warns her, he won't. Lyra looked at the old man. Because if he does, I'll make sure his death takes days instead of minutes. Corvin nodded shakily. I'll do it. I'll help you. The plan came together quickly. Corvin sent his message through the hidden channels he'd been using to communicate with Mira. False troop movements, fake supply reports, every piece of information carefully crafted to lead their enemy into a killing zone. 6 hours later, Mira took the bait. Her elite forces hit the western barracks with everything they had, expecting minimal resistance. Instead, they found 3 companies of Lyra's best soldiers waiting for them. The slaughter was efficient and brutal. Through the distance glass, Lyra watched Mira's forces realize too late that they'd been deceived. Watched them try to retreat and find their escape routes blocked. Watched her sister's carefully coordinated army fragment into chaos. But she also watched Mira herself, standing on a ridge overlooking the battle, and saw the moment her sister understood what had happened. Saw her turn and look directly at the command tower, as if she could see Lyra watching her. Saw her smile. That smile made Lyra's blood freeze, because it wasn't the smile of someone who'd been defeated. It was the smile of someone who'd planned for this. The explosion ripped through the western barracks 3 seconds later. The entire structure went up in flames, taking Lyra's elite forces with it. The trap she'd set had become a trap for her own people. Lyra stood frozen, watching her soldiers die, and understood with horrible clarity what had happened. Mira had known about Corvin's betrayal, had known he would turn, had fed him information knowing he'd eventually confess, had planned for Lyra to use him against her, and Lyra had played directly into it. The command room erupted in chaos again, but Lyra couldn't hear it over the roaring in her ears. She'd been outmaneuvered, outthought. She'd believed she was 10 steps ahead, but Mira had been 20. Elias grabbed her arm. We need to evacuate. The fortress is compromised. Lyra looked at him. Her vision felt strange, like she was seeing through water. How? Corvin? Elias said grimly. Whatever he told them about our defenses, Mira used it to plan this perfectly. She's been hurting us exactly where she wants us. Lyra turned to look at Corvin. The old man had collapsed into a chair, his face buried in his hands. You knew, Lyra said. You knew she'd turned your betrayal against us. Corvin looked up. His eyes were empty. I suspected, but I hoped I was wrong. Lyra raised her dagger. This time, she didn't hesitate. The blade found its mark, and Corvin died without making a sound. His body slumped forward onto the map table, blood spreading across the territories he'd helped destroy. Lyra pulled the blade free and wiped it clean. Evacuate the fortress, she said. Her voice sounded like it was coming from someone else, someone harder, someone who'd finally learned that mercy was just another word for weakness. Get everyone to the northern sanctuary. We're abandoning the capital. The room stared at her in shock. Move, she said. They moved. As the fortress emptied in organized chaos, Lyra stood alone in the command room with Corvin's corpse and the ruins of everything she'd tried to protect. She'd broken the bond to be free. She'd walked away from destiny to choose her own path. She'd become ruthless to save her people, and she'd lost anyway. The door opened. Elias stood there waiting. It's time to go, he said. Lyra looked down at her hands. They were covered in blood. Some of it Corvin's, most of it symbolic. The blood of every soldier she'd sent to die, every civilian she'd abandoned, every choice that had led them to this moment. She'd changed to survive. But survival, she was learning, came with a cost she hadn't known she'd have to pay. What if I can't be who we need me to be, she said quietly. Elias crossed the room and took her bloodied hands in his. Then become someone new. Again. As many times as it takes. Lyra met his eyes. I killed him. I know, I didn't even hesitate. I know that too. Does that scare you? Elias considered the question. Then he said, No. What scares me is the thought that you might break under the weight of what you've had to do. But you won't, because you're stronger than that. Lyra wanted to believe him. But as they left the command room and made their way through the abandoned fortress, Stepping over bodies and through smoke and past the wreckage of everything they'd tried to save, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd already broken. She just didn't know if what she'd broken into was stronger or just more dangerous. Outside, the city burned. The northern sanctuary was a fortress carved into the spine of the mountains, where the wind howled like something dying and the cold cut through layers of clothing like it had personal grievances. Lyra had been there once as a child, back when her father was still alive and the world made sense in ways it never would again. She remembered thinking it looked like the kind of place where hope went to freeze. Now she understood why. The evacuation had cost them 2,000 lives, maybe more. The numbers kept changing every time someone did a head count, and Lyra had stopped asking for updates because each one felt like another stone added to a weight she was already drowning under. They'd gotten roughly 40,000 people out of the capital before Mira's forces overran it completely. 40,000 out of 70. The math was simple and devastating. She stood on the eastern rampart, watching the horizon for signs of pursuit, and tried to remember what it felt like to sleep more than an hour at a time. Her body ached in places she didn't know could ache. There was a gash across her forearm from the evacuation that should have been stitched, but she'd been too busy to stop moving long enough for the healers to work. It had crusted over with dried blood and dirt, and every time she moved wrong, it split open again. Good. The pain kept her sharp. Elias found her there as dawn broke over the mountains. He looked like hell. They all did. 3 days of forced march through hostile terrain, followed by 48 hours of fortifying a sanctuary that hadn't been designed to hold this many people. But he was still standing, still steady, and that counted for something. "You need to eat," he said. "Later." "Lyra." She turned to look at him. "I said later." He didn't argue, just set a plate of something unidentifiable beside her and walked away. That was one of the things she'd come to appreciate about him. He knew when to push and when to let her be the stubborn disaster she needed to be. She picked at the food without tasting it, her eyes never leaving the valley below. Somewhere out there, Mira was consolidating her victory, taking control of the capital, probably executing anyone who'd been loyal to the old regime, probably making examples out of people to ensure compliance. Lyra had learned something crucial in the past week. Losing didn't make you weak, it made you dangerous. Because people who had nothing left to lose were the ones who burned entire worlds down just to watch the ashes scatter. She was still thinking about fire when Kael appeared. He moved differently now, less like a king and more like someone who'd been stripped of everything that made him certain. The bond breaking had done that to him, or maybe it was watching his kingdom collapse around him while he stood there unable to stop it. Either way, the man approaching her was not the Alpha King who'd ruled with casual authority. This was someone rawer, more honest. "We need to talk," Kael said. Lyra didn't turn around. "About what?" "About what happens next. We survive. We regroup. We take back what's ours." "With what army?" Kael moved to stand beside her. "Look around, Lyra. Half these people are civilians who've never held a weapon. A quarter are wounded. We have maybe 5,000 soldiers who are combat ready, and that's being generous. Then we make do with 5,000, against an enemy force of 30,000. Lyra finally turned to face him. "Are you suggesting we surrender?" "I'm suggesting we consider our options." There was a time when Lyra would have respected that, would have seen it as wisdom rather than weakness. But that was before she understood that sometimes the only option was to fight even when the odds were impossible, because the alternative was worse than death. "No," she said flatly. Kael's jaw tightened. "You're letting pride dictate strategy. I'm letting survival dictate reality." She stepped closer. "Mira won't accept our surrender. She doesn't want peace. She wants us erased. Every single person who ever stood against her wiped from existence. So our options are fight or die. I choose fight. Even if fighting means dying anyway. Especially then." The words hung between them like a challenge. Kael studied her face, and she could see him searching for the woman he'd been bonded to, the one who'd been measured and careful and willing to compromise. That woman was gone, had died somewhere between the Great Hall and the burning capital, and what had risen from those ashes was something harder. "You've changed," Kael said finally. "Everyone keeps saying that like it's a revelation. It is to me." He looked out over the valley. "I keep trying to find the moment where I could have stopped this, where I could have seen what Mira was doing and prevented all of it." "You can't. Kale glanced at her. Can't what? Can't go back and fix it. Lyra's voice was flat. What happened, happened. We made choices. Some of them were right. Most of them were wrong. But standing here trying to rewrite history doesn't change anything. So what do? We make different choices going forward. Like what? Lyra pulled a folded map from her coat and spread it on the rampart wall. Like this. She pointed to a series of marks she'd made. Mira's supply lines are stretched thin. She took the capital fast, but holding it requires resources she doesn't have. Food, medicine, weapons. She's relying on supply convoys from the southern territories. You want to cut her supply lines. I want to burn them to ash. Lyra traced the routes with her finger. We hit her here, here, and here. Fast strikes. Guerrilla tactics. Make her bleed resources until she's forced to either abandon the capital or pull troops from the front to protect her rear. That could work, Kale said slowly. But it requires soldiers willing to operate behind enemy lines with no support. Suicide missions. Then we ask for volunteers. And if no one volunteers, they will. Kale looked at her. How can you be sure? Because people who've lost everything are hungry for revenge. The briefing happened that afternoon in what passed for the Sanctuary's command center. It was a converted storage hall that smelled like old grain and desperation, but it was warm and mostly dry, which made it luxury compared to the rest of the place. Lyra stood at the front facing roughly 200 people. Soldiers mostly, but also hunters and scouts, and a handful of civilians who'd fought their way out of the capital with nothing but kitchen knives and rage. These were the ones who'd proven themselves capable, the ones who might survive what she was about to ask them to do. Elias stood to her right, Thane to her left. Kale was somewhere in the back, deliberately staying out of the spotlight. The hierarchy had shifted without anyone officially acknowledging it. Lyra was leading now, not because of any bond or title, but because she was the one willing to make the calls everyone else flinched from. She laid out the plan with brutal clarity. 3 strike teams, 3 different supply routes. Each team would have 10 days to complete their mission and make it back. The odds of success were maybe 50-50. The odds of survival were worse. When she finished, the room was silent. Then a woman stood up. She was young, maybe 20, with burn scars covering half her face from the capital evacuation. I'll go. Another voice, a grizzled veteran with gray in his beard. Me too. One by one, hands went up. Far more than Lyra needed. She'd been right. People who'd lost everything were the most dangerous kind of volunteer. They had nothing left to protect except the chance to make their losses mean something. She selected her teams carefully. Not the ones who seemed eager to die, but the ones who seemed determined to survive long enough to kill. There was a difference, and it mattered. As the briefing dispersed, Elias pulled her aside. You know most of them won't make it back, he said. I know. Does that bother you? Lyra met his eyes. Everything bothers me, but I can't let it stop me. He reached out and touched the reopened wound on her arm. You're bleeding again. I know that too. Let me stitch it. She wanted to refuse, wanted to keep moving because stopping meant feeling, and feeling meant breaking. But Elias was looking at her with something that went beyond concern, and she was so tired of being strong alone. Fine. They found a quiet corner in the infirmary. Elias worked in silence, his hands steady as he cleaned and stitched the gash. The pain was sharp and immediate, and Lyra welcomed it. Physical pain was honest. It didn't lie or manipulate, it just hurt, and then eventually stopped. When he finished, Elias didn't move away. He stayed close, one hand still resting on her arm. Talk to me, he said quietly. About what? About what's happening in your head. Because I can see you disappearing into yourself, and I'm worried that one day you'll go so deep you won't come back. Lyra looked at him. Really looked. At the concern in his eyes and the fear he wasn't quite hiding and the way he was trying so hard to be what she needed without demanding anything in return. I killed Corvin, she said. Drove a blade into his chest and watched him die, and I didn't feel anything. Not guilt, not satisfaction, nothing. That's shock. It'll catch up with you eventually. What if it doesn't? What if I've killed that part of myself? The part that feels remorse? Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the fact that you're worried about it means you haven't. How do you know? Because monsters don't question whether they're monsters. Lyra wanted to believe him, but she'd seen what she was becoming, had watched herself make choices that should have destroyed her and instead had just made her more efficient. She was learning that the difference between a leader and a tyrant was sometimes just a matter of perspective. "I need to ask you something," Lyra said, "and I need you to be honest. Always. If we win this, if we somehow manage to take back the kingdom and rebuild everything that's been destroyed." She paused. "Will you still want me when I'm not fighting for survival? When there's no war to justify the things I've done?" Elias cupped her face with both hands. "I don't want you despite what you're becoming. I want you because of it. Because you're strong enough to make the hard choices and human enough to hate yourself for them. That combination is rare." He kissed her then, and it tasted like blood and smoke and promises that might not survive the week. When they pulled apart, Lyra rested her forehead against his. "Don't die on one of these missions," she said. "Wasn't planning on it. Promise me." Elias smiled. "I promise to do everything in my power to come back to you. That's the best I can offer." It would have to be enough. The strike teams departed at dawn 3 days later. Lyra watched them disappear into the mountain passes and felt each departure like a small death. These were her people now, her responsibility. And she was sending them into situations where the best outcome was survival and the worst was torture, followed by public execution. She was still standing there an hour after the last team vanished when Thane approached. "Scouts report movement in the valley," he said. "Large force, coming this way." "How large?" 10,000, maybe more." Lyra's stomach dropped. That was twice what they could field, even if they armed every able-bodied person in the sanctuary. "How long until they arrive?" 2 days. Maybe 3 if the weather turns." "It won't." Thane looked at her. "What are your orders?" Lyra thought about the 40,000 civilians sheltering behind these walls, about the children who'd already lost everything and were about to lose more, about the soldiers who'd followed her this far and deserved better than a massacre. "We fortify," she said. "Every entrance, every weak point. We set traps in the approach routes. We make them pay for every inch of ground. And when they breach the walls, if they breach the walls, we fall back to the inner sanctuary and hold until the strike teams return. That's a long time to hold. Then we hold longer." Thane nodded grimly. "I'll pass the word." As he walked away, Kael emerged from the shadows. He'd been listening. "You're planning to sacrifice everyone here," he said. "I'm planning to buy time, by using 40,000 people as bait." Lyra turned on him. "What would you have me do, Kael? Run? Abandon the only defensible position we have? Scatter into the mountains and let Mira hunt us down one by one?" "I'd have you consider surrender." The word landed between them like a weapon. Lyra laughed. It was a harsh, broken sound. "You really think she'd accept it? You think she'd let us walk away after everything that's happened? We could negotiate terms." "There are no terms. There's only her winning or us refusing to lose. Those are the same thing." "No." Lyra stepped closer. "Losing means giving up. Refusing to lose means fighting until there's nothing left to fight with. It means making sure that even if she wins, the victory costs her everything. That's madness. That's survival." Kael stared at her. "When did you become so ruthless?" "When I realized that mercy gets you killed." The next 48 hours passed in a blur of preparation. Every able body worked on fortifications. Trenches were dug, barriers erected, archers positioned on every high point. The healers set up triage stations and stockpiled supplies. The civilians were moved to the deepest parts of the sanctuary, where the walls were thickest and the chances of survival highest. Lyra moved through it all like a ghost, checking every detail, correcting every mistake, pushing people past exhaustion because exhausted and alive was better than rested and dead. She slept in 90-minute intervals, standing up most of the time because lying down felt too much like surrender. Food became something she consumed mechanically, fuel rather than pleasure. Her body was starting to shut down in small ways, tremors in her hands, blurred vision at the edges. The wound on her arm had gotten infected despite Elias's stitching, and now red lines were creeping up toward her shoulder. She ignored it all. On the second night, a runner found her on the eastern wall. "My lady, enemy forces have been spotted 5 miles out. They'll reach us by dawn." Lyra nodded. "Sound the alarm. Get everyone to their positions." As the bells started ringing, Elias appeared. He took one look at her face and swore. You're burning up, he said, pressing a hand to her forehead. I'm fine. You're infected. That wound needs treatment. After. After might be too late. Lyra met his eyes. Then it's too late. She pulled away before he could argue and made her way to the command post. The final briefing was short and grim. Everyone knew what was coming. Everyone understood the odds. When Lyra finished outlining the defense strategy, she looked out at the faces staring back at her. These people had followed her through hell, had trusted her with their lives even when she gave them every reason not to. They deserved better than this. But this was what they had. I won't lie to you, Lyra said. What's coming is going to be brutal. Some of us won't see tomorrow. Maybe most of us. But I want you to remember something. She paused, making sure every eye was on her. We're not fighting to win anymore. We're fighting to make sure that when they tell the story of what happened here, they have to admit that we made them earn it. That every inch of ground cost them blood. That even in defeat, we were never broken. Her voice hardened. So when they come at dawn, I want you to show them what happens when you push people past the point where they have anything left to lose. I want you to make them afraid, not of our strength, but of our refusal to quit, because that's the only weapon we have left, and it's enough. The room erupted in fierce agreement. War cries and pounded fists and the sound of people who decided that if they were going down, they were taking as many enemies with them as possible. As the gathering dispersed, Lyra felt hands on her shoulders. She turned to find Kael. That was a good speech, he said. It was the truth. I know. He hesitated. I'm sorry. For what? For not seeing what you saw, for doubting you, for letting my own weakness compromise everything. Lyra shook her head. We all made mistakes, Kael. The difference is, I've stopped pretending mine were anything else. He looked like he wanted to say more, but the moment passed. He nodded once and walked away, and Lyra wondered if that was the last real conversation they'd ever have. The hours before dawn were the longest of Lyra's life. She walked the walls, checking defenses one final time, speaking to soldiers who looked too young to be facing what was coming. She found the burn-scarred woman who'd volunteered for the strike teams and learned her name was Sarah. Found an old veteran named Marcus who'd served with her father and promised to look after the younger fighters. Found 100 small moments of humanity in people who were about to become casualties. When the first light touched the horizon, Mira's army appeared. They came in formation, disciplined and organized, their banners snapping in the cold wind, 10,000 soldiers moving like a single organism. And at their head, mounted on a white horse that looked too pure for the blood it was about to wade through, was Mira herself. Even from a distance, Lyra could see her sister's smile. Elias appeared at her side. Ready? No. Me neither. They shared a look that said everything words couldn't. Then Elias kissed her hard and fast, like he was trying to memorize the taste in case it was the last time. Come back to me, Lyra said. I'll do my best. He moved to take his position with the forward defenders. Lyra watched him go and felt something crack in her chest. Not breaking, just acknowledging that there was a possibility she'd never see him alive again. She pushed the thought away and focused on the approaching army. Mira's forces stopped just outside arrow range. A single rider approached carrying a white flag. Tradition dictated that Lyra meet him. Tradition also dictated a lot of things that had gotten them into this mess. She went anyway, with Thane and Kael flanking her. The messenger was young, probably conscripted from one of the territories Mira had conquered. He looked terrified, which meant he was smarter than most. He read from a scroll in a shaking voice. Lady Mira Vance offers terms. Surrender now, and she will spare the civilians. Resist, and everyone dies. Lyra took the scroll and read it herself. The terms were exactly what she'd expected. Complete capitulation, execution of all military leadership, the remaining population to be absorbed into Mira's new order. She looked up at the messenger. Tell my sister I have terms of my own. The boy blinked. What terms? Lyra pulled out her dagger, the same one she'd used to kill Corvin. She drove it through the scroll, pinning it to the ground. She can go to hell. And if she wants this sanctuary, she's going to have to dig us out one corpse at a time. The messenger fled. Kael looked at her. So that's your answer. That's my answer. They walked back to the walls in silence. Behind them, Mira's army began to move. War drums started beating, a rhythm that sounded like a heartbeat amplified into thunder. Lyra climbed to the highest point of the eastern wall and looked out at what was coming. At the army that would likely kill her. At the sister who'd burned everything just to prove she could. At the end of a story that had started with destiny and prophecy and sacred bonds and had devolved into this. Two forces meeting in the mountains. One trying to hold, one trying to break. She thought about the strike teams out there somewhere, hopefully completing their missions. Thought about the civilians huddled in the sanctuary's depths. Thought about Elias and his promise to come back. Thought about all the choices that had led to this moment and wondered if any of them could have been different. Probably not. Because this was what happened when you pushed people to their breaking point. They didn't break. They transformed into something sharper. The first volley of arrows darkened the sky. Lyra drew her sword, and the blade caught the early morning light. Around her, 40,000 people prepared to show an army of 10,000 what it meant to fight someone who had nothing left to lose. The arrows fell like rain, and the battle began. The arrows fell, and the world became noise. Lyra had been in skirmishes before, border disputes and honor duels where blood was spilled according to rules everyone agreed on. This was different. This was the sound of 10,000 people trying to kill 40,000 others, and the mathematics of it were obscene. Steel on steel. Screams that started human and ended as something else. The wet thud of bodies hitting stone. She fought on the eastern wall until her sword arm went numb, until the infection in her wound spread fire through her veins and her vision started to blur at the edges. She watched Sarah take an arrow through the throat and keep fighting for 30 seconds before she understood she was already dead. Watched Marcus hold a breach single-handedly until reinforcements arrived, his white beard soaked red. Watched 100 small acts of heroism that would never be recorded because history was written by whoever survived to write it. The battle lasted 7 hours. When Mira's forces finally pulled back to regroup, Lyra counted the cost. 2,000 dead. Another 3,000 wounded badly enough that they'd never fight again. The walls were holding, but barely. One more assault like that, and they'd crack. She stood in the command post covered in blood that wasn't all hers and tried to think past the exhaustion. Her body was shutting down in ways that couldn't be ignored anymore. The infection had spread up her arm and across her chest. Her fever was high enough that she could feel her brain cooking. She had maybe 12 hours before she collapsed completely. She needed to make them count. Elias found her leaning against the wall, trying to stay upright through sheer stubbornness. "You need a healer," he said. "I need a miracle. Those aren't mutually exclusive." He moved closer, and she could see the fear in his eyes. The real, raw kind that came from watching someone you loved die by inches. "Lyra, if you don't get treatment, you won't survive the night. Then I better work fast." She pushed past him before he could argue, made her way to the eastern rampart where she could see Mira's camp. They'd pulled back to just outside arrow range, close enough to make a statement, close enough that Lyra could see her sister moving among the tents, probably planning the next assault. An idea formed. Terrible and desperate and exactly the kind of thing someone with a death wish would attempt. She was still working through the logistics when Thane approached. "Scouts report the strike teams have started reporting back," he said. "2 teams successful, 1 still missing. That was better than expected. How much damage?" "Supply depots destroyed across 3 regions. Mira's reinforcements can't reach the capital. She's cut off." Lyra felt something shift in her chest. Not hope exactly, but possibility. If Mira was cut off, if her supply lines were burned and her reinforcements trapped, then she couldn't sustain a prolonged siege. She'd have to either commit everything to breaking the sanctuary now or retreat and regroup. Neither option was good for her, which meant Lyra had leverage. She turned to Thane. "Send a messenger under white flag. Tell Mira I want to meet. Just the 2 of us. Neutral ground. That's suicide." "Probably." "Do it anyway." The response came within the hour. Mira agreed to meet at dawn in the valley between their positions. No guards. No weapons. Just 2 sisters and whatever pieces were left of the family they'd both destroyed. Kale found Lyra as she was preparing to leave. "This is insane," he said. "She'll kill you the moment you're within reach." "Maybe. Then why go?" Lyra looked at him. Really looked at the man she'd been bound to for years. The one she'd walked away from to find out who she was without someone else defining her. He looked older now. worn down by choices that had all been bad in different ways. Because I'm the only one who can end this, Lyra said. Because every hour this continues, more people die. And because I'm tired, KL. I'm so tired of fighting. That's the infection talking. No, that's me finally being honest. She walked away before he could stop her. Elias was waiting by the gate. He'd known she'd try to leave. Had probably been standing there for the past hour just waiting for her to make the attempt. I'm going with you, he said. No, not negotiable. Lyra felt anger flare, hot and immediate, the kind that came from fear wearing a different mask. You can't. The terms were clear. He stepped closer. I don't care about the terms. I care about you walking into a trap alone. If you come with me, she'll never agree to talk. She'll see it as a violation and call off the meeting. Then I'll stay out of sight. But I'm following you. She wanted to argue, wanted to order him to stay, but she could see the set of his jaw and knew it would be pointless. Elias Storm was many things, but obedient had never been one of them. Fine, she said, but you stay hidden unless I signal otherwise. Deal. They left through the eastern gate an hour before dawn. The walk down into the valley felt longer than it should have. Every step required conscious effort. Her body kept trying to shut down, and she kept forcing it to move. The infection had spread to the point where she could feel it in her lungs when she breathed, a wet crackling that promised she was drowning from the inside. She'd always imagined death would be more dramatic. Instead, it was just tedious. Elias melted into the rocks halfway down. She couldn't see him after that, but she knew he was there, watching, ready to do something stupid and heroic if things went wrong. Things were definitely going to go wrong. Mira was already waiting when Lyra reached the valley floor. She stood in the center of the space, dressed in white that made her look innocent against the scarred landscape. The rising sun caught her hair and turned it gold. She looked like everything their father had ever wanted in a daughter. Beautiful, composed, untouched by the ugliness around her. Lyra knew better. She stopped 10 feet away, close enough to talk, but far enough to react if Mira lunged. Her hand instinctively went to her hip where her sword should have been before remembering the terms. No weapons, just words and whatever violence they could do with their bare hands. Sister, Mira said. Her voice was warm, almost affectionate. You look terrible. I've had a rough week, Mira smiled. That makes two of us. They stood there studying each other. Lyra tried to find some resemblance to the girl she'd grown up with, the one who'd taught her how to braid flowers into her hair and sneak sweets from the kitchen. That girl was gone. Or maybe she'd never existed. Maybe Mira had always been this creature wearing a sister's face, and Lyra had just been too naive to see it. Why did you do it? Lyra asked. Not the exile, not even coming back. But why did you have to burn everything? Mira's expression didn't change. Because you had everything and didn't appreciate it. You were handed power and destiny and love, and you treated it like it was a burden. It was a burden. See? That's the difference between us. Mira started walking in a slow circle, and Lyra turned to keep her in view. You had everything I ever wanted, and all you could do was complain about how hard it was. Do you know what I would have given to be in your position? What I would have sacrificed? You sacrificed plenty. Just other people's lives instead of your own. That's what power is, sister. Using other people to get what you want. Lyra felt something cold settle in her gut. She'd been right. There was no reasoning with this, no negotiation possible. Mira had gone so far past the line that she couldn't even see it anymore. Is that why you called this meeting? Mira asked. To lecture me about morality. No. Lyra straightened despite the pain. I called it to offer you surrender. Mira laughed. It was a bright, delighted sound that belonged nowhere near this much death. You're surrounded, outnumbered, half dead from infection. And you're offering me surrender, yes. Why would I possibly accept? Lyra smiled. It felt strange on her face, like she'd forgotten how the muscles worked. Because I destroyed your supply lines. Your reinforcements can't reach you. Your army is cut off and running out of food. You have maybe 3 days before they start deserting. Mira's expression flickered. Just for a second. But it was enough. You're bluffing, Mira said. Am I? Lyra pulled the reports from inside her coat and held them up. 3 strike teams, 3 supply depots, all burned. Your southern territories can't feed an army that size, and the northern routes are controlled by people who hate you. Mira's mask slipped further. Her smile turned sharp and mean. Even if that's true, I still have enough forces to break your walls. I can starve you out and lose half your army doing it. Then what? You take a broken kingdom filled with people who despise you, and you have no resources to hold it. You've won nothing but ash. The silence that followed was thick with mathematics. Lyra could see her sister calculating, weighing options, trying to find the angle that gave her victory. What are your terms? Mira said finally. Single combat, you and me, right here. Winner takes everything. Mira's eyes narrowed. What's the catch? No catch. If you win, my people surrender. If I win, your army stands down and you face trial for everything you've done. That's not single combat. That's suicide. You can barely stand. I know. Then why offer it? Because I'm tired of other people dying for our family's problems. Mira studied her face, looking for deception, looking for the trap. But there wasn't one. Lyra meant every word. She was done watching people die because two sisters couldn't resolve their jealousy like adults. And if I refuse? Mira asked. Then we both lose. Your army starves. Mine dies defending walls that will eventually fall, and whoever's left gets to sort through the rubble and wonder what the point of any of it was. Mira was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was softer, genuine. You really would die just to end this? Yes. Why? Because someone has to pay for all of it, and I've made my peace with it being me. The words hung between them like a confession. Lyra saw something flicker across Mira's face. Not remorse exactly, but recognition. A moment where she saw her sister clearly for the first time in years. Then Mira nodded. Fine. Single combat. No interference from either side. Lyra felt relief mixed with terror. She'd expected Mira to refuse, had half hoped she would, because now she had to follow through on a promise that would probably kill her even if she won. Mira pulled a knife from her boot. I thought we agreed no weapons, Lyra said. You agreed. I lied. Of course she had. Mira came at her fast, faster than someone that small should have been able to move. The knife flashed in the early morning light, aiming for Lyra's throat. Lyra twisted, using momentum to throw Mira past her, but her body didn't respond the way it should have. The infection had slowed her reflexes, made her clumsy. The knife caught her side, not deep, but enough. Another wound to add to the collection. They circled each other. Lyra's breath was coming in gasps now. Each inhale felt like drowning, each exhale like giving up. Her vision was starting to tunnel, darkness creeping in at the edges. She was dying. The realization came with strange clarity. She wasn't going to survive this fight. Even if she somehow disarmed Mira, even if she landed a killing blow, her body was done. It had given everything it had and was shutting down piece by piece. She had minutes, maybe less. Better make them count. Mira came at her again. This time Lyra didn't try to dodge. She stepped inside the knife's arc and drove her elbow into Mira's face. Felt cartilage crunch. Felt blood spray hot across her knuckles. Mira stumbled back and Lyra followed. No technique now. No strategy. Just violence born from years of resentment and fresh grief. They fell together rolling in the dirt. The knife skittered away. They fought with fists and teeth and whatever body parts could do damage. It was ugly and desperate and nothing like the honorable duels Lyra had been trained for. This was two sisters trying to kill each other with their bare hands because words had failed and weapons felt too impersonal. At some point, Lyra ended up on top, her hands around Mira's throat, squeezing, watching her sister's face turn colors, watching the fear bloom in her eyes as she realized she was going to die. Lyra could end it, right here, right now. Could choke the life out of the person who'd destroyed everything, who'd burned the kingdom and killed thousands, and ruined any chance at peace. Her hands tightened. Mira's struggles grew weaker, and Lyra saw herself clearly for the first time since this started. She was becoming the thing she'd feared, the ruthless leader who solved problems with violence, the person who justified atrocity with survival, the monster wearing a hero's face. If she killed Mira like this, strangled her in the dirt while she begged with her eyes for mercy, then she'd proven that everything Mira said was true, that power corrupted, that people were just animals fighting over scraps, that there was no such thing as honor or justice, only winners and losers. She couldn't let that be true. Lyra released her grip. Mira gasped, sucking in air. Her hands came up to her throat, feeling the damage, looking at Lyra with confusion and terror. "Why?" Mira choked out. "Why didn't you finish it?" Lyra sat back, exhausted beyond measure. "Because someone has to be better, and I'm tired of waiting for it to be anyone else." She stood up, her legs nearly gave out, but she forced them to hold, looked down at her sister lying in the dirt covered in blood and bruises and fear. "You won," Lyra said. "Not the way you wanted, but you won. You broke the bond. You destroyed my life. You got exactly what you aimed for. Then why does it feel like I lost? Because winning isn't the same as being right." Lyra turned to walk away, made it 3 steps before her legs finally gave out. She hit the ground hard, tasted blood and dirt, and couldn't find the strength to stand back up. She heard footsteps approaching, heard voices shouting, heard Elias calling her name. Then darkness swallowed everything. She woke up 3 days later in a room that smelled like herbs and infection. Her body felt like it belonged to someone else, distant and broken, and held together with stitches that pulled tight every time she breathed. Elias was sitting beside the bed. He looked like he hadn't slept since she collapsed. His eyes were red-rimmed and his jaw was covered in stubble, and when he saw she was awake, he made a sound that was half laugh and half sob. "You're alive," he said. Lyra's voice came out as a rasp. "Surprised me too. The healers said it was close. Another hour and the infection would have killed you. Good thing I have such great timing." Elias leaned forward and took her hand. His grip was gentle, like he was afraid she might shatter. "Don't ever do that again." "Do what?" "Nearly die for dramatic effect. I'll try to keep my near-death experiences more mundane." He laughed, and the sound was so full of relief it made her chest ache. She squeezed his hand as much as her weakened grip allowed. "What happened?" she asked. "After." Elias's expression turned serious. "Mira surrendered. She's being held for trial." Her army stood down when they saw her give the order. Most of them were mercenaries anyway. Without pay, they had no reason to keep fighting. And our people? Safe. "We lost too many, but the rest survived. They're calling you a hero." Lyra closed her eyes. "I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who was too stubborn to die quietly. That's close enough." She lay there processing information. The war was over. Mira had surrendered. The kingdom could start rebuilding. Everything she'd fought for had somehow, impossibly, worked out. So why did she feel so hollow? Because winning came with a cost that couldn't be measured in body counts or territory gained. She'd changed in ways that couldn't be undone, had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed, had learned things about herself that she'd spend the rest of her life trying to unlearn. "You're thinking too loud again," Elias said. "I'm thinking about what comes next, what does come next." Lyra opened her eyes and looked at him, at this man who'd stood beside her through everything, who'd promised to come back and kept his word, who looked at her like she was someone worth saving even when she wasn't sure she agreed. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I broke the bond to find out who I was without it. Turns out I'm someone who makes terrible decisions and survives mostly through luck and spite." Elias smiled. "Could be worse. Could be better. Could be exactly what it needs to be." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Outside, Lyra could hear the sounds of the sanctuary coming back to life. Children playing, people laughing, the ordinary noise of existence continuing despite everything that had tried to stop it. She thought about Mira locked away somewhere awaiting trial, thought about Kael and what role he'd play in rebuilding, thought about the civilians who'd survived and the soldiers who hadn't, and all the choices that had led to this moment. She thought about destiny and prophecy and sacred bonds, and how all of it had been noise meant to drown out the simple truth that people chose their own paths, that free will was terrifying and beautiful and the only thing that actually mattered. "I want to testify at the trial," Lyra said. Elias looked surprised. "Why?" "Because Mira deserves to face someone who understands why she did what she did." "You're going to defend her." "No. I'm going to tell the truth about both of us, about what jealousy and resentment can do when left to fester, about how easy it is to justify terrible things when you convince yourself you've been wronged. That's generous. It's necessary." Lyra shifted in the bed, wincing at the pull of stitches. "If we're going to rebuild, we can't just punish the people who broke things. We have to understand why they broke in the first place." The trial happened 2 weeks later in the Great Hall that had been rebuilt, hastily, from the ruins of the capital. It was smaller than before, rougher, but it held everyone who needed to be there. Mira was brought in chains. She looked different, smaller somehow. Without the army and the power and the grand plans, she was just a woman who'd made catastrophic choices. She sat in the center of the room, surrounded by witnesses and accusers, and waited for judgment. The charges were read: conspiracy, murder, destruction of sacred bonds, use of forbidden magic, treason. Each one carried a death sentence on its own. Together, they painted a picture of someone irredeemable. When it was Lyra's turn to testify, she walked to the center of the hall and stood before the council. Elder Thessa was presiding, ancient and implacable. Kael sat to her right, representing the crown. To her left was Commander Thane, representing the military. They asked Lyra to recount what happened. She did, leaving nothing out. The manipulation, the charm, the betrayal. The way Mira had systematically destroyed everything just to prove she could. When she finished, Thessa spoke. "And what punishment do you recommend?" The question hung in the air. Everyone expected Lyra to call for execution, for blood to pay for blood, for the kind of justice that felt satisfying in its finality. Instead, Lyra said, exile, permanent and irrevocable. Strip her of name and title. Send her so far from here that she can never threaten us again. The room erupted in protest, people shouting that it wasn't enough, that Mira deserved death for what she'd done, that mercy was weakness. Lyra raised her hand for silence. When the noise died down, she continued, "Killing her doesn't solve anything. It doesn't bring back the dead. It doesn't rebuild what was destroyed. It just adds one more body to the pile." She turned to look at Mira. Her sister was crying, silently, tears streaming down her face like she'd finally run out of masks to hide behind. "But exile gives us something execution doesn't," Lyra said. "It gives us the chance to be better than what we've been, to prove that we can break cycles instead of perpetuating them." Thessa studied her face. "And if she returns, then we deal with it. But I don't think she will. I think living with what she's done will be punishment enough." The council deliberated. It took hours. When they finally reached a verdict, it was split but decisive. Exile by a margin of 1 vote. Mira was taken away to be prepared for transport. As they led her past Lyra, she stopped. The guards allowed it. "Thank you," Mira said quietly. Lyra met her eyes. "Don't thank me. This isn't mercy. This is me refusing to become what you tried to make me." Mira nodded, then looked away. "I'm sorry. For all of it." "I know. Do you forgive me?" Lyra considered the question. Forgiveness felt too big, too final, like closing a door on something that should stay open as a reminder. "Ask me in 20 years, Lyra said. "Maybe by then I'll have an answer." They took Mira away after that. Lyra watched her sister disappear through the doors and felt something release in her chest. Not closure exactly, but completion. The story that had started with 2 sisters and a sacred bond had ended with both of them free. One through exile, one through choice. It would have to be enough. In the weeks that followed, the kingdom slowly knit itself back together. Not the same as before. That version was gone, burned away in the fires Mira had set. But something new was forming in its place, rougher, more honest, built on choices rather than destiny. Kael stepped down as Alpha King. He said it was because the role demanded more than he could give, but Lyra suspected it was because he'd finally realized that power wasn't the same as purpose. He took a position on the council instead, advising on matters of tradition and law. The council restructured. Instead of elders appointed for life, they instituted terms. Instead of decisions made behind closed doors, they opened the process to representatives from every territory. It was messy and slow and sometimes frustrating, but it was more honest than what had come before. Lyra was offered a dozen positions. Commander, counselor, even queen, though that suggestion was quickly withdrawn when she laughed so hard she reopened one of her healing wounds. She turned them all down. Instead, she took a small house on the edge of the rebuilt capital. Close enough to be involved if needed, far enough to have space to figure out who she was now that the fighting was done. Elias moved in with her after asking exactly once and being told yes before he finished the question. They built a life together that looked nothing like destiny. No sacred bonds, no prophecy. Just 2 people choosing each other every morning and sometimes choosing themselves instead when they needed space. It was ordinary and complicated and exactly what Lyra needed. She learned how to sleep through the night without dreaming of battles. Learned how to look at her scars without seeing failures. Learned that healing wasn't about forgetting, but about carrying the weight differently. Some days were harder than others. Some days she woke up and felt the phantom pull of the bond that no longer existed. Some days she saw Mira's face in crowds and had to remind herself it was just memory playing tricks. But most days, she woke up and felt something she'd never expected to feel again. Free. 6 months after the trial, Lyra received a letter. It was delivered by a merchant who'd been traveling through the far southern territories. The seal was broken, the paper stained with travel, but the handwriting was unmistakable. She opened it sitting on her porch with Elias beside her. Read it twice before she could process what it said. Mira had found work in a small village as a healer's assistant. She was using a different name, Living Quietly. The letter was short and factual, no apologies or justifications, just an update, a way of saying she was still alive and trying to be someone different. At the bottom, in smaller script, were 3 words. Thank you, sister. Lyra folded the letter and set it aside. She didn't respond. Didn't need to. Some conversations were better left unfinished. Elias reached over and took her hand. You okay? Yeah, I think I am. They sat there as the sun set over the rebuilt capital, watched lights begin to flicker on in windows, heard the sounds of people coming home from work and children being called in for dinner, the ordinary noise of life continuing. Lyra thought about everything that had happened, about the girl she'd been who believed in destiny and sacred bonds, about the woman she'd become who'd learned that the only thing sacred was choice, about the future stretching out ahead of her, undefined and terrifying and full of possibility. She thought about forgiveness and whether she'd ever truly manage it, about redemption and whether it was even possible for people who'd done the things they'd done, about legacy and what would be remembered when all of them were gone. Mostly, she thought about freedom, real freedom, not this kind that came from breaking bonds or walking away from power, but the kind that came from accepting that you couldn't control everything, that sometimes the best you could do was survive and try to be slightly better tomorrow than you were today. It wasn't the ending she'd imagined when this started. Wasn't the triumphant victory or the tragic sacrifice. It was just life continuing despite everything that tried to stop it. And somehow, that was enough. Elias squeezed her hand. What are you thinking about? Everything. Nothing. She turned to look at him. Mostly I'm thinking about how strange it is to be happy after everything. Is it happy? Lyra considered the question. Close enough. He smiled and pulled her closer. She leaned against him, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, and let herself be present in this moment, not thinking about yesterday or tomorrow, just here, just now. In the distance, she could see the mountains where the sanctuary still stood, could see the forests where the strike teams had changed the course of the war, could see the valley where she'd faced Mira and chosen mercy over vengeance. All of it was still there, the scars on the landscape matching the scars on her body, permanent reminders of what had been lost and what had been saved. But when Lyra looked at it now, she didn't see tragedy. She saw survival. She saw people who'd been pushed past their breaking points and had bent instead of shattered. She saw proof that even when everything falls apart, you can build something new from the pieces. And maybe that was the real lesson. Not that destiny was fake or that bonds were meaningless or that power corrupted, but that being human meant constantly choosing who you wanted to be in the face of everything trying to make that choice for you. Lyra Vance had been chosen by fate to be an alpha's mate. She'd broken that bond and walked away from destiny. She'd learned to be ruthless when survival demanded it, and merciful when her humanity demanded more. She'd lost everything and rebuilt from nothing, and now, sitting on her porch with the man she'd chosen and been chosen by in return, watching the sun set over a kingdom that was learning to heal, she finally understood what freedom actually meant. It meant belonging to no one but herself. And for the first time in her life, that was exactly enough.